Hi, I'm Amanda Morgan from Not Just Cute, and I'm here again with Heather Shumaker talking about her book, It's Okay Not to Share. And we are talking about Section 8 today, sensitive subjects. And we're jumping ahead. This is the first one that you'll find embedded in the post at the same time that the post goes up. But this one I really appreciated, Heather, because it's talking about sensitive subjects, and you talk specifically about you talk about teach sex ed in preschool, which I mentioned earlier is a great provocative title, and we'll get into more about what it really means. And then be friends with dead birds. And I appreciate it because I kind of struggle with some of these. I have to laugh that when I was pregnant with my fourth, and some of my boys were asking about, well, how does the baby get out? And I totally chickened out. I turned and said, well, you better ask your dad because he saw more of it than I did. So that was my cop out. So do you want to talk a little bit about why it's important to answer our kids' questions, even when they make us uncomfortable or when they're tough subjects to broach?
Yeah, well, it is tough, and I think sometimes when we start out being parents, we don't expect these difficult subjects to start till they're teenagers. But really, both talking about things like sex ed and death need to start right from the beginning. And of course, you're not going to tell them every single detail. But a lot of kids, we're talking about how babies are made, for example. A lot of kids, it's a totally natural question because there's a lot of pregnant mothers around in their lives. The life of a young child, they see pregnant women. They have younger siblings, and they notice these things. They're not, they're obvious, and they have questions. Well, how's it going to get out? How did it get in? And I think these questions really bother adults, some adults, because you think, oh my gosh, I'm going to have to get into all the details, and I'm not ready for this, and my mother or my dad never talked to me about it, and so there may be nervousness, there may be no model to follow, and so you just don't know what to do, and you know, sometimes, as you did, you just kind of dodge the bullet. But it's going to come again because kids' questions will continue to come, and a good rule of thumb is if a child is old enough to ask, they're old enough to get an honest answer. They're old enough to
And
ask.
I love that approach that you had, that if you don't overthink it, which I have a tendency to do sometimes, if you just answer the questions that they're asking, if you just answer those, then you will be on their level. We worry so much about, you know, well, how much do I need to say and what's appropriate, and you lay it out in that chapter so well that what's appropriate is what they're asking right now, and to not over explain, but to just simply answer what it is they're actually asking. It's family lore. In my husband's family, his grandfather was a scientist, and so when his son asked about the birds and the bees, he launched into a huge scientific explanation that went way too big, and it's always been this family joke that, of course, if you ask a microbiologist about where babies come from, you're going to get this big slideshow. But to just get at what is it you're really asking, and you mentioned in the book you give some great follow-up questions so that you can get at what their question really is, because when they say where do babies come from, they might really be asking how's it going to get out, and while we're thinking about everything else. And so really following up and finding out what their actual questions are was a great eye-opener for me to realize I just take a breath.
Right. You don't want to give them too much information because they don't want too much information. And their attention may not, you know, you think, oh my gosh, this is the big question. It's just one more question like what we're having for breakfast. It's just a question in their mind. They don't feel that nervousness about it yet, and they don't feel any of those emotions that we may have about it. So if they ask a question that has to do with their bodies or how babies are made, you just ask a question back. What is it you want to know? And clarify, as you were talking about, the level of their understanding. Or sometimes you say, what do you know about it? Oh, well, Jason at the playground said the stork comes. Okay, so now you know where the information came from and what misinformation may be coming. So sometimes finding out what they already know is helpful, and then you can correct misinformation, or you kind of know the level at what they're thinking, or ask, what do you want to know about that? What are you wondering about? And it's not dodging, it's just clarifying the issue. And then you just ask or answer one or two things, and then you also can afterwards say, did that answer your question? And they may have another question, but just to make sure that you close the end of the conversation so that they can go off and talk about what that squirrel is doing across the street. You know, they're going to leave the topic faster than you think. But also, books are your friend. especially if you're from a family that didn't talk about it or you just need some help. There are excellent books about bodies and how babies are made, and you can sit down, and if they ask a question, you don't have to hurry, but go to the library next week and get out a book and read about it. You want, I think also it's important that it's not one conversation. Like, oh, I did it. Whew. Yeah, it's an ongoing
exactly.
conversation. So the kids will ask one question at age 2. They'll ask maybe they'll ask the same question at age 4, but they're going to have a different need to know and a different level of understanding. So even though I started teaching my kids when they were 2, they still ask the same question, and I give them sort of a little more advanced level of information. It's a cycle, and they're going to keep wanting to know a little bit more each time. So you never have the big talk when they're a teenager because they already know by then.
And I love that, like you talk out with so many other topics in here, that underlying the hard topics of death and sex ed or whatever the topic may be, underneath that is just this open communication and how important that is with our kids, that just like with some of the other topics, that our reaction to their question is as important as our answers to their question, that we set this precedence that we're open to talking about it. And I love, like you were mentioning, the misinformation that they might get from friends, and you talk about it in the book, that really if we're open to discussing hard subjects with our kids, they'll know, first of all, that they can come to us when other kids are talking about it or when they have questions, but it also might get them the information before somebody else is giving them misinformation. And whether that's on the playground or just the over-sexualization that we see in the media, today more than ever, it's important that we make sure that our kids' education is coming from us on some of these tough subjects, because someone else will do it for us, for better or for worse, and most likely for worse.
Yeah, they will learn it from the source. And it does come very early. Kids will teach each other things very early. So it's, you know, you may think you're being early, and they probably already know some things.
That's true. That's really true. And in talking about death in your section, is it Be Friends with Dead Birds or Buddies with Dead Birds? I love that title also. And I think it's another topic where we tend to shield children from it, and there's an appropriate level of that. There's some things, particularly on TV or in the news, that's too much. But like you said, in natural settings, you know, when there's a dead animal like a dead bird in the yard or something like that, it's a great time, again, to take it as it comes and look at it and answer questions and address death on an age-appropriate level. Once again, I remember a friend who had a close family member die when he was, I think, in high school or college, and I remember him mentioning that he'd never been around death before, basically, and I thought, what a shocker to never have. He said, I never had a pet die, I've never had anything die before, and I just thought, kind of to your point, that it needs to be somewhat familiar. We need to have questions about it and answer questions about it, because it is a part of life. It's another part of life, and to have the information ahead of time, again, just like this, similar as the topic we were talking before, that it's going to come sooner or later, and to make sure that kids are prepared with the right information. So do you want to talk a little bit about how you recommend talking to children about death, and also you address when we are grieving, when it is a more personal issue and adults are grieving, and how we handle children when we ourselves are grieving, and how we share that grief and grieve appropriately together. I think that's a tricky subject that you address.
Well, I think, first of all, with death, that adults don't often recognize. We think of childhood, and we think of balloons, and we think of swings, and all these happy things. But actually, especially in the preschool years and onward, coming to terms with their own mortality and their own death, and the death of their parents and everybody else and their pets, is something that children are just realizing for the first time. I mean, can you imagine being at a time when you didn't know you were going to die? We kind of forget it as adults, but you know, kids for a while, they don't even know that they're going to die. And then around age 4, depending on the child, they figure out that living things die. And this is a big shocker. And so they have to process that. It's a huge part of child development, and we just don't even always notice it. But a lot of the play that children do, especially if you see them falling down pretending to be dead and then they get back up, or having people die in stories or anything like that, that's kids processing emotionally the fact that they are mortal. And then they may ask questions, oh, Mommy, Daddy, what happens when are you going to die someday? And Usually it catches us unawares. You know, we're about to rush off to work or something, and they say, "Mommy, are you going to die?" And you think, "Oh my gosh, not right now." You know, I don't want to talk about this. But it occurs to them, and we need to give them an answer. And what's important here is that we give them an honest answer. Yes, I'm going to die, but probably not today. Or, you know, give them a level of safety, but then they want to know, basically, it's all about me, me, me. Who's going to take care of me? So if you die, okay, then, well, Daddy will take care of you, or whoever it is in your family. Okay, well, what if Daddy dies? Well, then Aunt Sarah's next in line. She's going to take care of you, and you'll go live in her house. Okay, well, what if... So they want to know what's the plan and how they're going to be taken care of. And that makes them, it seems a little morbid, but it makes them feel much more comfortable and relieved. And you can say it's probably not going to happen. I expect to live a long life. But, so don't sugarcoat it and say, no, I'm not going to die. For one thing, it's a lie. But also, you know, let them know what the plan is. As far as... and again, books can really help. I think that young kids particularly come up with two different experiences with death that they see a lot of is pets. The family dog dies or a grandparent dies in the family. That's very typical. And sometimes that's the kid's first experience of death. So that's why I call it Be Buddies with Dead Birds. Because if you look at a dead worm or a dead bird or a dead mouse or something that's a small animal that's dead, a dead spider, and you talk about what happens to the physical body, then it's a little bit easier for them to even understand what happened when the dog died or the grandparent died. Because if they're missing the dog or missing their grandmother, they're so busy coping with the emotions, they just think she's gone on a trip and she'll come back. Or when are we going to dig him out of the ground and let him run around again? And so there's so much information that if they can be exposed to some level of it early on, then that's just helpful for when somebody they dearly love dies. And you were talking about grieving also. I think that's part of it, is that they need to have the information and the chance to have the emotions. And when we are grieving as adults, we behave differently than a grieving child. So a grieving child may not act sad. They may laugh and play, and then they'll act differently. So they may be worried that they're a bad kid for having fun, you know, when everybody else, the adults around them, are sad. So there's a lot of things. They will react differently. And this is about the kind of grieving that goes on more with a pet or an extended family member. If a sibling or a parent, somebody in the household dies, that's a different level, and there's grief resources for that. But I'm talking about someone that they know, but it's a little more removed from their daily life.
And as you mentioned, sometimes it takes a little bit of time. Like sometimes there are children, like you said, that will act very normally, and then months after the event will break down emotionally because they've finally processed everything and the finality of it has sunk in. And so that's one thing that I've mentioned with parents as well, that, you know, talk to them about it and go through that grieving process, but be ready for it to possibly come back months and years down the line because they're processing it on different levels. As they mature, they may have to revisit that and process it at the level that they're at presently.
Yeah. And another thing with young kids is adults will often use euphemisms. Oh, she went to heaven. Oh, she passed away. Oh, she got sick and died. And when we say things like this, we forget that the kids get confused. She passed where? She what? He went to heaven sounds like she went to Colorado and is going to come back again, or went on a trip and is going to come back. And when we say got sick, well, that makes them, if they get a cold or a fever, they're worried that they're going to die because they got sick. So we have to be careful sometimes of our words and differentiate. So say she got very sick with a bad disease, and this kind of disease people don't always get better. It's different than when you threw up last Tuesday, to make it separate so the kid isn't worried.
That's a great tip as well. That's when I've noticed like you mentioned, sometimes we take this easy out, and it actually complicates things and makes them more difficult for the child to process, because we're talking about it on a way that's comfortable for us, but that they can't understand or process at that level. So that's a great reminder for us as adults to make sure that we're very clear about it, and again, open to questions, like you've mentioned, to follow it up and say, so do you have any questions? Do you understand?
Right.
And those types of things.
All of us who are alive don't really know what happens with death. So when kids ask those questions, well, what happens when you die? We can talk about the physical body, and it gets cold and it gets stiff and different things. But what about, is there a heaven and what happens and all that? It's going to really depend on you personally, your family, and there are books that will explain death in various ways. So if you want to teach your child about that there's a spiritual life and that there's a heaven or something like that, there are picture books that will help explain that story, geared for young kids. And if you want to explain it a different way, there's storybooks that will do that. So you want to read them ahead. You want to read these books before you read them to your child, and decide if this is the message you want to be giving about the non-physical part of death. Generally, and it's okay to say, I don't know. If that's where you are, or if that's what you want to tell them so they can make up their own mind. Not every parent, even if they believe a certain religious idea, wants to impose that on their kids. They want their kids to come to their own ideas. So it's important to answer that side of it also, and to say many people have different ideas, because you can be guaranteed they're going to talk to the neighbor kids or the kids at school. Well, my mom says this. Well, my dad says this. And they're going to realize the answers are drastically different. And it's okay to talk about how different families have different ideas, but we won't know till we get there.
Well, I love this section. It really addresses some difficult subjects that we want to dodge, and gives some great ways that we can just be calm and ask the right follow-up questions, and gives us a starter. And I love that you do, just as you mentioned, that you leave it open to the different ways that we may want to answer, but give us that starter script to start us down the path, and then to be able to fill it in with the ways that fit our own families. And I love that flexibility that you introduce in every section in this book to make it personal to our families. And it's great advice. And if I had to just boil it all into one thing, I would just say it's to answer kids' questions as they ask them, because that's, like you said, they're ready to know what they're ready to ask, and that's a great rule of thumb to live by. And great pointers in this section for addressing some of those difficult sections. So I appreciate you writing that for me and for everybody else who reads the book. We have a couple of more hangouts scheduled with some bloggers that we're really excited to chat with, and then I think we just have one closing one where we'll answer some more readers' questions as we close up this section. But it's been such a great read along, and I really appreciate you sharing it with us. Not only in book form, but in these chats. It's been really enjoyable and really eye-opening for me. So thank you, Heather, and thank you for joining us while you're out on a trip, making that extra effort to join us today.
Thanks so much, Amanda.
Absolutely. Again, this is Amanda Morgan from NotJustCute.com. And we will join in with Heather a few more times. You can join the read-along wherever you're at. Each section can stand alone, or you can begin again at the beginning. But join on in and catch this great book that Heather's written. So we will see you at the next Hangout. Thank you, Heather.
Bye-bye.
Bye.